I never considered myself paranoid, but ever since I moved into my new place, I started counting things. Not obsessive counting, mind you, just a little routine I fell into. I count my windows before bed, the door locks, and sometimes even the steps it took to get from my bedroom to the front door. At first, it was just a way to calm myself. Living alone for the first time in a quiet, somewhat isolated neighborhood was a big adjustment. But now, I'm starting to think the counting wasn't just a habit, it might have been a warning. The house itself wasn't anything special, just a 2-bedroom bungalow on the outskirts of a small town, the kind of place people forget about as soon as they leave. It had charm in the daylight, with a large porch that looked out over an overgrown garden and an old, creaky swing that I planned to fix up one day. But at night it felt different. It was as if the shadows had a weight to them, clinging to the walls and stretching across the wooden floors longer than they should. It all started innocently enough. One night, after a long day at work, I locked the front door, made sure all the windows were closed, and headed to bed. As I lay there, half asleep, something nagged at me. I couldn't remember if I'd checked the kitchen window. I got up, groggy and annoyed, and walked through the dark house, my footsteps echoing off the hardwood. Sure enough, the kitchen window was unlocked. Should have been locked. I was sure of it. I clicked it shut, double-checked the front door again, and went back to bed. But that unease stayed with me. I felt stupid for getting worked up over something so trivial, but from that night on, I started checking everything twice. First the doors, then the windows every night before I slept. It became a ritual. I'd walk through the house at dusk, making sure everything was in its place. I knew it was a little excessive, but it gave me peace of mind, at least for a while. 2 weeks ago, something changed. It was a Thursday, and I was working late trying to meet a deadline. By the time I got home, it was dark, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees outside. I did my usual round, starting with the front door. Lock, check. Windows, all locked. But as I finished my rounds and headed to bed, I realized I'd forgotten the back door. I cursed under my breath and went back downstairs. The moment I reached the kitchen, I froze. The back door, which I never used, was wide open. It's important to note that I never leave the back door unlocked, let alone open. It led to an overgrown yard surrounded by thick woods, and I hadn't even bothered to clear a path back there yet. I walked closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and shut the door. I locked it, bolted it, and stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the knob as if waiting for it to turn on its own. Nothing happened. I tried to shake it off, blaming my exhaustion. Maybe I'd forgotten to lock it that morning. Maybe the wind had blown it open, even though the latch was pretty solid. Still, something about it didn't sit right with me. I grabbed a chair and propped it under the doorknob before heading back to bed. That night, I didn't sleep well. In the morning, I found the back door closed, just as I had left it. I told myself I was being ridiculous and went about my day. But when night fell again, the unease returned. I did my rounds, double-checking everything, including the back door. Locked, bolted, and chair firmly in place. Then, 3 nights ago, things got worse. I had just finished my nightly routine and was settling into bed when I heard it. A soft creak, like with straining under weight. It wasn't loud, but in the silence of the house, it might as well have been a scream. I sat up, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing. Then it came again, this time followed by a faint thud, like something or someone moving just outside my bedroom. I tried to convince myself it was the house settling. Old houses made noises, after all. But when the sound came again, closer this time, I knew it wasn't the house. I slowly got out of bed, every muscle in my body tense. The hallway outside my bedroom was pitch black. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the hallway, empty as always. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to walk toward the source of the sound. Step by step, I moved closer to the back of the house, where the kitchen and back door were located. When I reached the kitchen, my heart sank. The back door was wide open again. The chair I had wedged under the doorknob was still in place, undisturbed. I could feel the cool night air seeping into the room, carrying with it the faint scent of wet earth. I stepped closer, my phone's light flickering as if something was interfering with it. I knew, deep down, that I hadn't left that door open, but the alternative, that someone had opened it while I slept, was too terrifying to consider. I shut the door again, locking it, bolting it, and wedging the chair even tighter than before. This time I placed a heavy cast iron pan on the seat of the chair, just in case. I barely slept that night, lying awake, listening for any sound that might suggest someone, or something, was inside my house. The next morning, everything was as it should be. The back door was closed, the chair was in place, and the pan hadn't moved. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Last night I made a decision. I wouldn't sleep. I'd stay up and watch the back door, see if I could catch whatever, or whoever, was behind this. I brewed a pot of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the door for hours. Nothing happened. The night dragged on, the wind howling outside, but the door stayed closed. Around 3 a.m. I started to feel foolish. Maybe I was just sleep-deprived. Maybe it really was just the wind. And then, just as I was about to give up, I heard it. A soft, deliberate creak from the other side of the door. The creak came again, this time louder. My heart raced as I stared at the door, frozen in place. I didn't dare move. My eyes were glued to the handle, expecting it to turn any second. But it didn't. The sound stopped, leaving me in a suffocating silence. For a moment, I thought I imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me after hours of sleeplessness. But deep down, I knew better. Something was outside, watching, waiting. I stood up slowly, trying not to make a sound, and crept closer to the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the chair I had wedged under the doorknob. I considered leaving it there, pretending I hadn't heard anything, but I couldn't. I had to know. I had to see. With one quick motion, I yanked the chair away, my breath shallow and uneven. The door didn't budge. I pressed my ear against it, listening for any movement on the other side. Nothing. Just the low whistle of the wind. I gathered my courage, unlocked the door, and slowly pulled it open. The yard beyond was bathed in moonlight, casting long shadows across the overgrown grass. The trees swayed in the breeze, their branches scratching at the sides of the house like skeletal fingers. Everything looked normal, empty, still. But something felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still. I stepped outside, holding my phone up to light the way. The yard stretched out before me, bordered by dense woods that seemed to swallow the light whole. I took a few cautious steps forward, the grass wet and cold beneath my bare feet. I scanned the yard, my flashlight flickering as I swept it from side to side. And then I saw it. At the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the light, something moved. A shadow, tall and thin, slipped between the trees. My heart leaped into my throat, and I froze, unsure whether to run or scream. The figure was barely visible, blending into the darkness of the woods, but I knew it wasn't my imagination. It was there watching me. Before I could react, the shadow disappeared, melting into the trees like smoke. I stood there, breathless and trembling, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. But there was nothing, just the rustling of the leaves and the distant hum of the wind. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I couldn't stay out here. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. Or if it was, it wasn't something I wanted to confront in the dead of night. I turned and bolted back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked it again, this time sliding a deadbolt across for good measure. I grabbed the chair, wedged it under the knob, and backed away, my eyes fixed on the door as if expecting it to burst open at any second. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound my ragged breathing. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting, listening, but the creak never came again. Whatever was outside, it was gone. For now. I barely slept that night, every creak of the house sending a jolt of panic through me. When the sun finally rose, I dragged myself out of bed and forced myself to act normal. I had work to do, and I couldn't let this, whatever it was, consume me. But all day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I decided to do something different. I barricaded the back door with furniture, chairs, the kitchen table, anything I could move by myself. I even stacked a few heavy boxes I had yet to unpack. If someone or something tried to get in, I would hear it this time. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I sat in the living room, every light in the house blazing, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. Midnight came and went, and still nothing. The unease that had been gnawing at me started to subside. Maybe it really had been my imagination. Maybe the shadow I saw was just a trick of the light. But then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone. A whisper. It was faint, almost too soft to hear, but unmistakable. A voice, muffled, like it was coming from inside the walls, called out my name. Liam. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding in my ears. I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but I was alone. The voice came again, this time louder, clearer. Liam. It was coming from the back door. I stood there, paralyzed with fear. The whisper was low and raspy, as if whoever or whatever was calling me had been waiting a long time to speak. My mouth went dry, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. The barricade was still in place, the door firmly locked. But the voice persisted, soft and insistent, like it was inside my head. I backed away, my mind racing. I didn't want to believe it. Couldn't be real. But the whisper grew louder, more urgent, until it felt like it was coming from all around me. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the voice stopped. Silence fell over the house again, heavy and oppressive. I stood there, trembling, waiting for it to start up again. But it didn't. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I sat in the living room, the barricaded door in my line of sight, and waited for the sun to rise. When morning finally came, I didn't feel relief. I felt dread. Something had called my name last night. Something knew I was here, and I had no idea what it wanted. I spent the next day in a daze. My body moved on autopilot as I went through my usual routine, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the night before over and over. The shadow in the yard, the voice whispering my name. It all felt surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But the barricade was still there, untouched, and the door remained securely locked. Whatever had whispered my name, whatever had been outside, hadn't come inside. Yet, I didn't go to work. Couldn't. I called in sick, my voice shaky as I left a voicemail for my boss. Afterward, I sat in the kitchen, staring at the barricaded door, wondering what I was supposed to do. Should I call the police? What would I even tell them? That I saw a shadow and heard a voice whispering through the door? They'd think I was losing my mind. Hell, I was starting to think that myself. As the day dragged on, the anxiety gnawed at me. I couldn't stay here, not alone, not after everything that had happened. But where could I go? I didn't have any close friends in town, no one I could crash with. My family lived 2 states over, and I hadn't spoken to them in months. Even if I could leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that running wouldn't solve anything. Whatever this was, it wasn't just some random intruder. It felt personal. That evening, as the sun began to set, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone, contemplating calling someone. Anyone, just to hear a voice that wasn't my own. But before I could dial, there was a knock on the front door. It wasn't loud or urgent, just a casual knock, like someone was stopping by for a friendly visit. My blood ran cold. I hadn't had any visitors since I moved in. No one in this town even knew me well enough to drop by unannounced. I stayed completely still, holding my breath, listening. The knock came again. 3 soft taps. I got up, heart racing, and quietly made my way to the living room. The front door was just a few feet away, separated by a narrow hallway. I peeked through the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, was outside. There, standing on my porch, was a man. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, with his back turned to me as he looked out at the street. His posture was relaxed, casual, as if he had all the time in the world. Something about him was off, though. His presence didn't make sense. It was getting late, and no one should have been out here. The neighborhood was quiet, almost deserted after dark. The man knocked again, this time a bit louder, more insistent. I considered ignoring it, but something deep inside me told me that wouldn't work. Whoever this was, they weren't going to leave until I answered. I took a deep breath and moved toward the door, careful to stay quiet. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I didn't open it. Instead, I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who is it?" There was a pause, then the man spoke. His voice was low, smooth, and eerily calm. "Just checking on you," he said. "Wanted to make sure everything's all right in there." His words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't recognize the voice, and there was something unsettling about how casual he sounded. Like he knew me, but I had no idea who he was. "I'm fine," I replied, trying to sound firm. "You should leave." Another pause. Then, the man chuckled, a low, almost amused sound. "That's good to hear," he said. "But I think you should open the door." His words weren't a request. They were an instruction, command. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. There was no way I was opening that door. Something about this man felt wrong, like his very presence was a threat. But before I could respond, he spoke again. "You've been having some trouble lately, haven't you?" he said, his voice still calm, almost friendly. "Strange noises, doors opening on their own, things out of place." My heart skipped a beat. How could he know that? I hadn't told anyone, hadn't mentioned it to a soul. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay calm. The man didn't answer right away. I could hear him shifting on the porch, his footsteps soft on the wooden boards. Then he spoke, his voice lower now, more serious. "I'm here to help, Liam." Hearing my name from his lips was like a punch to the gut. I hadn't told him my name. He shouldn't have known it. My pulse quickened, and my hand tightened around the doorknob, but I still didn't open it. "I don't need your help," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was silence on the other side of the door, the kind of silence that stretches on just long enough to make you doubt everything. I thought maybe he had left, maybe he had given up. Then came the knock again. But this time it wasn't from the front door. It came from the back. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The barricade was still in place, the back door securely locked, but the knock came again, soft but unmistakable, like someone tapping gently on the wood. I took a step back, my mind racing. How could he be at the front and back at the same time? It wasn't possible. "Liam," the voice called from the front door again. Still calm, still patient. "You should open up. We need to talk." I backed away, the room closing in around me. The knock from the back door came once more, then stopped. I could feel my legs shaking, my body on the verge of collapsing under the weight of the terror that gripped me. "I know what you've been seeing," the man continued. "I know what's been bothering you. Let me in, and I'll explain everything." I wanted to scream, to tell him to go away, to leave me alone. But the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy. I glanced toward the back door, then the front, unsure where the next knock would come from. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. Then, without warning, the knocking stopped. Both doors fell silent, as if nothing had ever happened. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall and my ragged breathing. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the man didn't speak again. There were no more knocks. I was alone, or so I thought. For a moment, the silence seemed to stretch on forever. I stood there, paralyzed, waiting for the man to knock again, to speak, to give some clue as to what he wanted from me. But the house remained deathly quiet. My breathing was the only sound I could hear, ragged and shallow. I backed away from the door slowly, my body trembling with fear, but I couldn't stay frozen forever. I had to do something, but I had no idea what. My phone was in my pocket, and for a moment I considered calling the police. But what would I tell them? That a man who seemed to be in two places at once was knocking on my doors? That I had been hearing whispers from the walls? They'd think I was crazy. The only thing I knew for certain was that staying in this house any longer was not an option. I needed to leave. I grabbed my keys from the kitchen counter, my hands shaking so badly they nearly slipped out of my grasp, and headed for the front door. But as I reached for the handle, something stopped me. A feeling, an overwhelming sense that if I opened that door, something worse would be waiting for me on the other side. My hand hovered over the knob, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I noticed it. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, shifting beneath the door. Someone was standing there, waiting for me. I froze. The knock came again, louder this time. "Liam," the voice said, calm and smooth. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I backed away from the door, heart racing, my mind screaming at me to get out, to find another way. I turned and ran to the back door, ready to move the barricade and escape through the yard. But as I reached it, I stopped dead in my tracks. The back door was wide open. I know for a fact I had locked it, bolted it, and barricaded it with chairs and boxes. But now it stood open, as if inviting me into the darkness beyond. Cold night air blew in, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else. Something faint, almost metallic. I stepped back, trying to understand how this could be happening. Then, from the shadows outside, a figure emerged. It was him, the same man from the porch, now standing in my backyard, his dark clothes blending into the night. He didn't say anything, didn't move toward me. He just stood there watching. His eyes, even from the distance, seemed to pierce right through me. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. How could he be here? How could he have gotten past the barricade without making a sound? It didn't make sense. "You can't run, Liam," he said, his voice steady and unhurried. "You've already let us in." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him, my chest tightening. Us? What did he mean by us? As if in answer, I felt a cold presence behind me. Slowly, I turned around, and my stomach dropped. Standing in the hallway, just a few feet from where I had been moments ago, was another figure. It was tall and thin, dressed in the same dark clothes as the man outside. But its face was wrong. It was pale, almost translucent, with empty, hollow eyes and a mouth that twisted into a grotesque smile. I backed away, my breath caught in my throat. There were no footsteps, no sound as it moved toward me, just the quiet shuffling of something unnatural in its movements. I glanced back toward the open back door, where the man still stood, watching. "You shouldn't have ignored the signs," he said, his voice calm, almost sympathetic. "The noises, the door, the shadow. We were warning you." I felt the walls closing in on me, the air too thick to breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing fit. The shadow creature in the hallway was drawing closer, its hollow eyes fixed on mine, its twisted smile growing wider. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The man on the porch smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth barely lifting. "You're the one who invited us in, Liam. You broke the rules." "What rules?" I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. "I didn't do anything." The shadow figure was almost on top of me now, its cold presence pressing against my skin. I could feel its breath, icy and unnatural, as it leaned in closer. "The rules are simple," the man outside said, his tone still maddeningly calm. "Count your windows. Count your doors. Keep track of what's inside and what's out." A sickening realization washed over me. The counting, my nightly ritual. I had been counting the windows and the doors, locking them, securing them. But last night, when I heard the whisper, when I panicked, I hadn't counted. I hadn't followed the routine. I had let them in. The creature's cold, empty eyes bore into mine, and I knew there was no escape. It was already too late. The man on the porch nodded, as if reading my thoughts. "Once you lose track, we're free to come in." I stumbled backward, my legs giving out beneath me as I collapsed to the floor. The shadow figure stood over me, its grotesque smile widening, its cold breath sending shivers down my spine. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please." But there was no mercy in its empty gaze. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the man on the porch, still standing there, watching, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "You should have counted, Liam," he said softly. "You should have counted." And then the shadows swallowed me whole. In the days that followed, the house sat quiet and empty. The neighbors noticed nothing strange, just another empty house on the outskirts of town. People came and went, but no one stayed for long. The house had a reputation, after all. Those who did visit, however briefly, would later report hearing strange noises at night. Creaks in the floorboards, whispers through the walls, doors that seemed to unlock on their own. And sometimes, if they weren't careful, they'd forget to count their windows or their doors. And that's when the shadows would come.